So before we begin, Jacques, just thank you so much. I have been reading your books for many years. Passport to Magonia is one of my favorite books on the topic. So I'm very honored that you want to talk to me.
Well, thank you very much. As uh, as you may recall, Passport to Magonia at first was rejected by people who were interested in UFOs because they thought it was a distraction from what is going on now. You know, that it couldn't possibly be an old subject. And then gradually the book became people started to like the book, and it became probably many people think that it's the best book I wrote. um, I don't think so because it's so specific to history and so on, but it goes to a much deeper level of the problem than we usually talk about,
Mm.
especially in America.
Oh, definitely, definitely. But maybe we should just get into it. I think a lot of our listeners definitely know who you are, but we also have uh, people who maybe not know too much about the UFO subject. So maybe you can start by telling a little bit about your background, Jacques, like what you used to do, and of course also what you do now and how you got interested in the field of UFOs.
Well, and interrupt me whenever you want to. Uh, I I wanted to be a scientist. I was fascinated with science when I grew up. My brother became a medical researcher specialized in radiation, the effects of radiation in the French hospitals and so on. So I was surrounded with people interested in science. And then when I was about 14, I saw a UFO, and I never tried to hide it. I never tried to. It was it was clearly unidentified. This was in a small town where we lived, about an hour outside Paris. This was by a beautiful afternoon. The sky was blue, no clouds. My mother. This was during a holiday, so my mother was working in the garden, and I was helping my father in the house do some hobby. And then my mother called us, and I rushed down to the garden, and there was, essentially an oval object over the steeple of the church, of the cathedral in the town. The town was called Pontoise. And we saw that. I mean, it was not moving, no noise. Again, very quiet afternoon, the best conditions to observe something like this. There was a clear dome on top that I remember distinctly. And then the next day, I spoke to a friend of mine from the college about what I had seen, and he had seen it too from his house. It was about a quarter, about maybe a kilometer up the hill from where we lived, and he had looked at it with binoculars. And I said, "Can you draw it?" And he drew it, and what he drew was exactly what we had seen. So you had, three witnesses, the best observing conditions. My father was a judge, very used to the human testimony and
Mm.
all its spectrum. And he said, there are new airplanes now. The first jets were being tested and so on. But this was not a jet. I mean, this made no noise whatsoever, and it did not move. Um, I tended to put it aside. And then a few years later, I was working at Paris Observatory, and we were getting a lot of letters from people who were seeing UFOs, and I realized that what we had seen was, in fact, a UFO. So I never tried to hide it, or I went through a career in science with my colleagues, knowing that I was not only that I was a witness, but that I was really interested in my own research on the subject. And I think that's something to remember, that there is no sense in hiding this, certainly now, 65 years later.
Yeah.
People know that it's there. It was hard to do research on this in France. France was very traditional in astronomy. Those were the early computers. I started working with computers very early, and I think I'm fortunate that I've seen the full arc of the development of computer science from the beginning, actually.
Yes.
But to really pursue this, I had to be in the U.S., where the U.S. was much more open to this. And you could have a career in science without being rejected by your colleagues because you were. It's funny that Europe, for historical reasons, Europe has a rationalist philosophy, certainly in science, and yes, you have to be rational, and you have to look for proof of everything.
Yeah.
But that word is misunderstood. It doesn't mean that you have to restrict the phenomena that you look at, to things that have to do with matter and with because for one thing, we cannot define matter anyway. Now, matter is molecules, but molecules mean atoms. Atoms mean particles. Particles mean what? So that frontier has been moving to quantum mechanics and to all of that, and we have never resolved the contradictions between general relativity and quantum mechanics. We never did. Even the physics school of Copenhagen, had to fight over this, and they never resolved it in the days of Einstein. So in the U.S., I found many colleagues who were interested in the subject, and so I was fortunate to work with, at places like Stanford Research Institute and Stanford Research had.
Can you say the last part again, Jacques? For 1 second, your audio just went out.
So after I had been in the United States, I worked with Dr. Hynek at Northwestern University in Chicago, and I had access to the files of the Air Force, which were not classified. There were a few cases that were classified, but most of the cases were, open to scientists. They were not published, but they were open. And I rebuilt the first catalogs of cases, at that time, and found that there were patterns in the phenomena that could be studied scientifically. Later on, I moved to California, and there, those were the early days of the internet through the ARPANET, and I worked at Stanford Research Institute, where we had machine number 3 on the network. And by the time I joined, there were something like 20 or 30 computers on the network. Okay, the network became the internet.
Yeah.
So there I had the tools to do more research and to become involved with private groups that were beginning to do serious research on UFOs, and I've continued to do that. And I've, as you know, kept a journal, kept a diary from the beginning when I was in France. So now it covers half a century of this research. And it, because it's a journal, it's very personal. It talks about what I went through, the moments of joy and, pleasure and moments of discouragement, and many different theories about what the phenomenon was. So today, many people are coming into the field, and I think it's useful when we were doing studies in the United States, in California, about the future of technology. We would always look, we said, if you want to look 10 years in the future, you have to start by looking 50 years in the past, 5 times. The time you want to go ahead, you need to look back, because the roots of what you're going to do in 10 years are already there. They were there before. We just didn't use them, or we didn't think they were important, and now they may become important. So you have to look back first. And I think that's where my contribution may be. Now new people are going to take the research forward, and I'm fortunate that I'm still alive and able to contribute to something, but now it has to be their research. And what I can bring is a history of how we came to today, to the state of the research today. So that's why I've continued to write my books.
Of course. It's very fascinating that being part of the early internet really is what is driving the topic forward today for most people, right? We share information on social media, on the internet in general, and that's why I think the topic today has reached so many people. My father was a ufologist himself in the 50s and the 60s. And just like you, and I'm sure that he's not here anymore, but I am sure that he knew who you were. His favorite movie was First Encounter of the Third Kind. But his generation didn't have the same ways to communicate as my generation because of the internet. So you can say that your work, both your scientific work, but also working alongside the new internet, is really what has been the driving factor for why we are here today, right?
Well, there were many people who were involved in building the internet, and at the beginning, this was almost secret, because you could be fired for working on this. Your boss could say, I'm paying you to work on my problem, not to work on UFOs.
Yeah.
But especially in France, it was almost like a conspiracy, among the few scientists who were interested. But it was, of course, that Dr. Hynek called it the Invisible College. The Invisible College was the group of scientists in the 18th century that became the Royal Society. Okay, but at the beginning they had to work against the church. The church says, there is no such thing. You have to follow, what the books are saying, and you should not go outside the books. Well, today we have a similar situation where it's not the church, but it's the academy says, there is no proof that UFOs exist. Um, well, the movement started with people mostly in France, like Olivier Costa de Beauregard, who was a leading relativist of world class. People like Professor Chauvin, who was a biologist, who was saying, what do we know about how nature becomes intelligent in a creature? Why humans? There would have been other opportunities for intelligence to be in different kinds of creatures, coming out of, for example, the octopus in the sea. The birds. Birds show intelligence. And it never developed for questions that had to do with biology, but a small change in biology could have, the birds could be the most intelligent species on the planet, not us. Those things could have happened, and they were accidents of evolution. Well, what do we know about evolution on other planets? Now, at the time, relatively few people believed that there was intelligence on other planets.
Yeah.
Today, every day we discover more and more indices, more and more, examples of things that can relate to life out in the universe. So that problem has changed, and it's fascinating to see how, of course, now we can say all this openly without secrecy. But it was fun to have a little secret society, around those cases,
Yeah.
because there were, as you said, there were so few opportunities to communicate outside of the scientific world. Now you can, address a million people at the same time.
Right.
Well, that's not necessarily always good, because that also means that there are rumors, there are um, false information in the system. There are different movements that, to some extent, are not interested in the facts anymore. They're not interested in the observations. They're interested in the politics. Well, the politics is important, but if you follow what happens in Washington right now, this is not a good time for science to bring up something new. Even space exploration being curtailed or being canceled in some areas. So it's difficult to rely on, on a political movement, or, a movement with government or Congress. Congress has tried to open up the topic, and other countries are waiting for the United States to take the lead. France has been, as you know, has a study that has gone on for 50 years now, in a small group within the Space Institute in France, started by Dr. Poher, many years ago. But it's not open to the world because everybody is waiting for America to acknowledge that the phenomenon is real and that it should be studied scientifically. That has not happened yet. So that's where we are today. There is a blockage of the information. In the meantime, you don't need to be to have a security clearance or to be, in order to study this, because, one of my neighbors yesterday said, "Oh, I've read your book, and my family saw something, 20 years ago." I mean, I still get all that information,
Yeah.
and it's not going to the government; it's going to researchers like me. So I think it's a strange situation.
It is, and it's so vast that it's very hard to even figure out where to start, really. And the researchers in the field know more, probably more than most people in the government or in the scientific branch. So it would take a lot of reverse education from the
Yes,
people to the scientists, actually, except for you and Dr. Gary Nolan and a handful of really knowledgeable people. And that process is so backwards and so difficult, right?
yes. Um, it's difficult because you have two clusters of observations. You have the observations by people in the field, farmers, truck drivers, cops, policemen, and then everybody, who is out in the evening or at night paying attention to what's in the sky and so on, and can see something, and we have those reports. Um, Probably we have only 1 out of 6 or 7 or 10 reports, because many people do not report it. When again, people who've read my book, come to me talking about what they have seen. But then I ask, did you ever report it to the police or to anybody else? And they say, no, we never reported it to anybody. And that's true also in Silicon Valley here, with um, presidents of companies, with chief engineers in Silicon Valley, who that I talk to in my work here, and they say, by the way, my family saw a UFO, over the ocean 15 years ago, and they give me the details because I know they want to help my research. But I say, am I authorized to talk about it? And they say, no, we don't, we don't want to be known in connection with the problem.
Yeah.
Um, and I cannot blame them because they are running a company. Um, what are people on Wall Street, in New York, think about a company that's run by someone who sees flying saucers?
Yeah.
You cannot do that.
No.
So they keep the information to themselves. But among technical people, there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest in looking at this, because how often in science do you have the opportunity to work on a complete new problem that involves everything? It involves relativity, quantum mechanics. It's right in the center of what's important in physics today.
Hmm.
So, why don't we study it? This is the center.
What
This is a kernel.
what would it take? Because my co-host is the fantastic Anja C. Sethi Andersen from the Niels Bohr Institute, and she's one of the only, I would say, open-minded astrophysicists here who are willing to talk about this on the record and have an open mind. And of course, in the States, we have a lot of actors who or scientists who are willing to discuss the topic. What do you think it would take to completely open the door for the scientific community and the politicians to really acknowledge, and for us to move even further along?
Um, I think that observations are not enough. I think people are going to want to see hardware. They want to see an object, a craft. And there are stories, of course, that craft have been captured. Certainly, and there is no proof of it yet, but good testimony from various people. We do have material, and as you know, Dr. Nolan and I have started to publish. We published a long article about the analysis of some residue from an observation where we have a dozen witnesses at the same time. We know all the names. Nothing was hidden. They went to the police or the fire department to report because there was a fire in connection with the object dropping. Essentially metal infusion that remained in fusion for 2 hours. And so the police was there, took pictures. I have the pictures. The fire department was there because to stop, there was a small fire, but it wasn't really dangerous. It was just a small grass fire. But then we have the testimony of the 12 people. We know where they were. We know what they saw in the sky. And then there were several analyses of the metal and several analyses of the trajectory of the object, and whether it could be a joke or a hoax. There are very, very good reasons for why this could not be a hoax. Somebody simulating this would have to carry 1/2 ton of essentially steel in molten, state, and drop it essentially in a public yard, in a public garden. So there was no way to do that, even no way to obtain the steel infusion at that point because the factories were closed. So this was published in the leading astrophysics, astronautics journal, in the world, and it was accepted by a committee of readers, of referees, and it took 4 years to get that paper published, but we think it's going to open the way to other scientists to begin to publish in physics journals and in all that. But it's hard. You have to go through every possible step in the science if you want people to pay attention. But I think we are at that stage now. At Stanford, scientists who...
Once again, sorry, Jacques, you said at Stanford and then you cut out. So
at Stanford University.
Yeah.
It began with Professor Sturrock. I worked with Professor Sturrock, and we worked in astrophysics together, published a number of papers in astrophysics, but he was very interested in UFOs and published several papers about it. And then, of course, when he retired, he gave me all his samples, all his material samples that people had been sending to him. And I'm passing that on to Dr. Nolan now, who is, taking it in a different direction since he is a biologist with a different set of instruments, a different set of scientific tools. So it's amusing that the Stanford is now known as a center for UFO research. And I'm not sure they like it, but the fact is that, science is what scientists do. As a scientist, I'm free of studying whatever I want, okay? I may have to find the money for it, but a lot of that can be done with very little money. I mean, I've never had any support for what I did. You know, I've done it with my own time and my own friends and my own resources. I think now we're going to get into a phase where funding is important. Of course, there was, you know, in Nevada, you know, Mr. Bigelow funded the NIDS organization, and then the BASS project was funded by the government. And so we know what can be done. I mean, those are good examples of what science can do.
Mm.
So, you know, I think that's a direction we should go.
Yeah, I agree. And then also, of course, something very important throughout time and history have been how this is being portrayed to regular people who are not scientists. Of course, me growing up, I'm born in '83. So my first encounter was, you know, E.T., Steven Spielberg movie. It was later on Independence Day, films like this, which sort of made me believe that UFOs was something fictional because it's made for entertainment. But nowadays we get way more documentaries, podcasts, where this is actually being discussed as a real thing, a real possibility. Um, how do you view the whole the communication aspect of films, documentaries, podcasts? Do you think is that also helping to bring forward this topic, or do people still view this more as entertainment than reality?
I think it is essential in this field, as it is in other fields like politics or art or anything else, because there is no way to stop it. You know, it's free. So, and that was, of course, one of the benefits of the architecture of the network. You know, the idea of when we were working on the ARPANET and then the internet, the idea was to build a communication network that nobody could stop.
Mm.
So it had a military aspect to it. One of the motivations was military, that you could not destroy the network. An enemy could not stop the communication. It would always continue. It could degrade if you kept dropping bombs. It would degrade, but it would always continue somewhere. And the much more important impact on society is that we now have a way of communicating that cannot really effectively be stopped.
Yeah.
Okay? So the discussions like the one we have now is, you know, all it takes is for you and me to agree to talk and to put it on the network. If people like it, people can, you know, communicate and, you know, can join in the information. And I think of course, it can go in many directions. Nobody is telling you what to say. You know. On television, somebody has decided to produce a show about a particular topic, and then that has been authorized. The funding, the financing has been authorized, and then the broadcast has been authorized. And of course, we're living this now in the U.S. with the recent news, you know, about things breaking through secure network, secure communication, and becoming public, and so on. But in the medium we're using now, we can pretty much say whatever we think. And if people believe that it's interesting, then they can get the book, and they can, if they have something to contribute, they can contribute it. And that has expanded the reach of the information and the impact of the information, to every country, every country on the planet.
If you look back, because you have some years to look back on with regards to this topic, no offense, you've been in the area for a very long time, and you said earlier to look 10 years ahead, we must look 50 years behind or back. If you, from what you've learned and looking into the future now, being of course a very innovative person yourself, with AI coming along, new, even more new ways to share and to quantify and to index data. How do you see us moving towards, clearer results with help from technology and maybe specifically AI? That's a very difficult question, I know.
No, it's a profound question. There are some negative aspects because it's so easy to get on the internet and talk about it and create a movement, go to Washington, put pressure on, Congress to hold hearings and so on, that people are not going into the field anymore to talk to the farmer who has seen something in the sky or has something that has scared his cattle, for example. And so I think in going back 50 years, one thing let's ask, what is it that we haven't done, that we failed to do? Okay? I mean, people have a wonderful picture of science. They think of science as, the guy or the woman in the lab, like Madame Curie, and you discover something and you write a paper and you get the Nobel Prize. Well, that's not what happens in science, because if you think that you've discovered something, you have 20 colleagues who are going to say that you made a mistake, that you should redo the experiment, or that somebody else should redo the experiment. One of the things we want to do with Dr. Nolan is have other people, we'll give them parts of the samples we have, and we've already done that with the French. They've given me some of their samples, and I've given them some of the samples of, the case that we just talked about in the US, for them to redo the experiment. And nobody is going to believe an experiment until it has been redone by another lab, okay? And they should not. So that's one thing we haven't done, is to really engage it's starting to happen. Get other scientists to redo the studies that we've done and to compare results. Yeah. That's beginning to happen now with many meetings and conferences and so on. But it's still superficial. It's not really the way it should be done in science with all the right controls. The other thing we have not done is to take care of the witnesses. Many witnesses have been hurt. This is not just somebody saying, oh, I saw a light in the sky. This is not it. As you may know, under the BAS project, which was, classified, I was in charge of the database building. Mm-hmm. Actually, we started with 12 databases, so it's known as a data warehouse, where you have different types of sightings and so on. We ended up with 240,000 cases, okay, that were filtered from many more. Okay, and we could get many more.
Yeah.
You know? So the problem after that is, how do you reconcile that within those cases? What are the patterns? And one of the most important patterns is that there are physiological effects, like people getting a sunburn.
Yeah.
A sunburn is not pathological; it's not going to kill you, but it's a physiological reaction. Okay, excuse me. But there are also pathological effects, like paralysis,
Yeah.
like people being hurt, by people being burned deeply, that require hospitalization, or it requires medical intervention and medication. So the question is, how many of those cases are there? Well, there are thousands of them, and this is not known. People have not paid much attention to that. The cases certainly I made 4 trips to Brazil. Everywhere I went, there were people who told me about unreported cases, cases that were not in the literature, that scientists did not know about, where somebody had been deeply hurt, either paralyzed or one case of a woman. I met her and her family. It's not exactly the Amazon, but it's in the edges of the Amazon. It's a very isolated area. There was people sleep in hammocks because it's very hot and very humid. There is no glass on the windows here. The windows are open so air can circulate. And again, it's so hot and humid, you need air, around you. And a light came in the sky, and there was a beam that touched her, a very narrow beam, like you think of a laser beam, but most of the time you cannot see a laser beam. But this was very clear; it was white, and it pinned her to the hammock. There was it pushed, and it was burning. It was, and she went to a doctor. The doctor took photographs. I published those photographs of the impact on her skin. There is no question this was not an insect bite. It wasn't any of that. She had been actually pinned to the hammock, and it was her skin was burned. We have a number of those cases in the files now. People don't know that. How do you make a beam that you can make a beam that will burn people? Okay, but how do you make a beam that will extend? In the air, will extend like this, and will touch somebody and will push on the person. How do you make a beam have a mechanical effect, that will burn the skin? We don't know how to do that. So, and we certainly don't know to do that out of a flying object that will disappear. So all those are in the files. Most people don't know that. And they don't realize that this has been verified by a number of people. Okay, and in my case, I went there and I met that woman. I have a picture of me and other investigators in the group, with the witnesses and her family. This is real. Okay, well, to go there, is not easy. You have to take the time to go there. You have to have a group that speaks the local language. You have to have a group that understands the dialects of Brazil. There are many different dialects. You have to understand how the culture works around them, who are the doctors, what about the law enforcement people, what about the press, how do people react, how do different religions react, and Brazil is especially complex and rich from, culturally from that. But that's true, that's true in Europe, it's true in France, it's true in many places where you have to go there, you have to meet the people, you have to understand their world, and you have to understand why the phenomenon is relevant to them. And then we need to support them. So there is a movement in England started by some very distinguished attorneys and scientists and medical people trying to gather funds to treat people who have had an impact like that and has changed their life. Okay. If it's a sunburn, well, you remember in Close Encounters, he looks out from his truck and half of his face turns red. Okay.
Yeah.
The other half of his face is not affected. Okay. That came from discussions that Mr. Spielberg had with Dr. Hynek and with me and so on. Where we gave him some of the special effects, literally special effect. But this is, people are suffering from that and they need support. And most psychiatrists will not take the case. Most medical people will just give you a few pills and they send you home.
Mm-hmm.
Well, isn't there something to be studied there? So I think this is a new frontier, and we don't need the government. We don't need anybody else. I mean, we need the attention of the medical community and the psychological and psychiatric community, because this is not standard. This is not a standard symptom, in their book. This is not what they learned in medical school.
Yeah.
We need to do that.
It's so fascinating. I would say when you do a show like this, and I've only been doing, I'm just, been researching a grain of salt compared to what you have been doing, but the amount of people that contact you with amazing stories is really, to me, probably the thing I go back to when I think about this topic. All of the people, I mean, hundreds of people have, talked to me. Either they've been writing me letters or emails or called me on the phone. And the stories they tell me, it's just mind-blowing. And I know that you have been, of course, been getting those calls and people contacting you for decades now. Because science and whether to determine something scientifically or not, that can be very hard. You can always be skeptical no matter the evidence. You can always claim that something is fabricated, that something isn't real, that some people have motives. But when it comes to everyday normal people in droves who've been seeing the phenomenon and experiencing the phenomenon, that to me really is the most difficult thing to discard and to not believe. Do you agree?
Yes, not only do I agree, but I think we are going in the wrong direction in looking only at the military cases.
Yes.
Everything that's happened in the last 4 years in Washington has been dealing with the military, and that's an American reaction. Is it a threat? America is still very, closed on itself intellectually, in that sense that when something unusual happens, we first think that it's a threat. Well, it could be a threat. So something that can do all that certainly could be threatening. But the movement has been to say, let's look at the best information we can get. And that goes back to what you said, what you said earlier. What's the best information we can get? The military in the last 10 years, certainly in the last 5 years, has acquired incredibly good scientific instrumentation. Those cameras, that look at the infrared, that have produced those images.
Yeah.
We know there was something there. There is no question there was something there. We have the radar from the ships. We have the radar from the airplane. And then we have the infrared pictures. So we know there was something there. And then we have very experienced pilots, people that we admire, people we trust in flying those aircraft, having actually seen it with their eyes. Several of the pilots described what they saw. Okay. And then the behavior of the object doesn't match what we would expect any flying normal, vehicle to do. So this is something that seems much better than the testimony of some farmer, or that woman hit by a beam somewhere in, the wilds of the Amazon.
Yeah.
Let's work with that. So all the attention in the U.S. has been in, interviewing the pilots, in interviewing the people who could come in with privileged information and so on, with classified information, and then readings from instruments. And of course, that's what Dr. Loeb is doing at Harvard. If we can design instruments, it will capture that. That would break the logjam. It would break the problem, and everybody would then can look at it. Well, yes, but I've spoken to some of those pilots. They have very limited ability to see outside, of course. I mean, they see through instruments.
Yes.
Well, what about the instrument? What about the pictures that the New York Times has published? They're not pictures. This is not your ordinary Kodak camera that you buy, at the local store. This is designed to capture infrared, not visual information. So what we know is that there was a source of heat there. So from that, we assume that there was an object, like of the kind we think of as a vehicle. That's not obvious. Half of the information is missing.
Yeah.
So that's why the scientific community is not reacting. A couple of years ago, we had a conference at the Sorbonne in Paris. I studied at the Sorbonne, as you know, in my young days, and I admire the institution. We had something like 300 people in the room. I asked, and there were people like Mr. Mellon from the US, there were several professors there and so on. We talked about all the data. And in my presentation, I asked how many people in the room work at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. There were 2, out of essentially over 300 people. The other professors stayed home. I mean, for playing with their kids on the weekend or, fishing or whatever. They didn't bother to come back to the Sorbonne to listen to a series of presentations by professionals working on UFOs.
Yeah.
Now, the 2 who were professors at the Sorbonne came to me afterwards, and they were laughing. They said, yes, well, this is a state of the academy, that their colleagues will only come when there are certain standards that are met. And those are the standards that Dr. Nolan and I, Dr. Sturrock and others, and Dr. Lowe are trying to establish, But this is the way the information has to be presented, and it should not present it as something you should believe in. Because you have no right to tell me what to believe in, and I have no right to tell you what to believe in. We can present information, and you have to convince yourself. And the way to convince yourself is to look at the contradiction, to see where I could be wrong, to redo the experiment, to redo it in a different way. And that's the way science works. I mean, there are lots of things that are not explained in today's science. There are lots of things we don't understand. And people think that, because they've taken a science course and they think science is presented as, this is the truth. It's not the truth. It's what the community of guys and women believe today because it's the best idea they've come up with. But that's not necessarily the truth. And there are big problems in science. There are other than UFOs that are just as important. I worked with Dr. Sturrock on models of the corona of the sun. We don't understand the corona of the sun. You can see it during a total eclipse. You can see, all those lights around the sun. Yeah. They are not close to the sun. They are some distance from the sun. The surface of the sun is cold. It's 10,000 degrees, which in astrophysics, that's essentially zero. Okay. So in fact, in the equations, you take the edge of the sun temperature as zero because it makes the calculation simpler. The inside of the sun is billions of degrees, okay? But the surface is cold. The corona is at millions of degrees. How does it get there? It's not in contact with the sun. But the radiation gets there in a particular way that creates the corona, which is this magnificent thing around the sun, which is at this incredible temperature.
Yeah.
How does that happen? I mean, something everybody can see. We've got the photographs. I mean, there is no mystery. How does it happen? Well, the guy who really solves that problem could get a Nobel Prize in physics. In medicine, what decides the time of the birth of a baby? A woman is pregnant, the baby is ready, the woman is ready, and nothing happens. And nothing happens for days. And then at some point, which is unpredictable, the baby sends a signal to the mother saying, I'm ready when you're ready. The mother says, I'm ready when you're ready. And boom, the baby is born.
Yeah.
Well, there are some theories about how that happens, but they're not, they're not very good. With Jupiter, at that particular moment. And of course, we don't believe that. There has to be something about, but it's not the mother and it's not the baby. It's the interaction, it's the message exchange process between the two that under certain conditions that we don't completely understand, triggers this is it, go. And so if you talk to people in the lab or people they will give you lots of examples like the things that they are working on, in botany, in zoology, and certainly in astrophysics, where we have no idea how the thing happens.
Yeah.
And so this is just one more, but it touches us very deeply, and it's involved with our beliefs, it's involved with our religions, it's involved with our life. I mean, what does it mean to be alive if there are creatures that can come out of nowhere, and do these things? Who are they? Can we communicate with them? All those questions are open, and I'm telling you, in Washington, they are not looking at this. They are looking at those pictures from the airplanes, because yes, physically, those are very good instruments. And we think that science should come with good documents from good instruments. But it's very limited.
Yeah.
And I want to continue looking at the bigger picture.
I think that's very smart. And something I've always been wanting to ask you is also, we barely know what consciousness is, right? I mean, it's not something that we completely understand.
With what?
We barely know what consciousness, the mind.
Yes.
Yeah. How does it work? Where does it go when we die? Do we have a soul? How does all of this really work? I think we don't really know for sure, and we also, I don't know how you perceive the world. You don't know how I perceive the world, not 100% at least. You may be seeing the world in different colors than I do. So how do we find like a universal language? Because when people talk about their experiences, they vary. Of course, there are a lot of traits that are equal between cases, but they're also very unique. Do you think that we have such a unique view on things that something that happens to me may be something completely different than what could happen to you when you saw a UFO? I mean, how can we have a universal language for something that seems to be so hard to grasp, so hard to understand?
There are, well, of course, those are the profound questions. And one of the reasons I remained interested all this time in UFOs is that it's a way to ask those questions. It directly reads on that kind of process. There are, of course, there are some answers. I mean, we can gather 1,000 people and ask them about the color red and define that color in terms of the wavelength, and so on. And yes, my eyes are different from your eyes, and there will be some systematic difference, but we can actually measure that now. I mean, we can. Okay. So, and there will be people who are extremes, either pathologically or physiologically, and we can see why. There are substances you can take that will change those colors. So, to some extent, we know the frontiers of perception and how we build the world. To some extent, the experiments with drugs have opened that up. With drugs that radically change the perception system.
Yeah.
I've never taken any of those drugs, and I don't intend to, but I'm not against people taking them. It's none of my business. And if I took them, it would be under medical control, under somebody monitoring me. But I've met Timothy Leary and people like that, and I understand that what you say about reality being malleable. It can be modified in many ways, and it can be modified by our brain. And one of the things I will always remember from my career, most of my work in the last 30 years has been in funding new companies, as an investor. As a venture capital investor with teams of people. And I'm not a financier, but I understand, how many goes into supporting certain inventions or certain ideas. One of the very successful companies that I helped finance was a company that was developing products for the pharmaceutical industry, not a drug, but something that would serve to develop drugs. For the brain. Now I asked, why don't you test it on mice or chimpanzees? And they said, well, mice don't think like we do, and chimpanzees don't think like we do, and we have to test it. But we cannot test it legally on human beings because it could be very dangerous. But we can test it on tissue that has been biologically created to approximate the brain in very careful conditions, and to see the reactions. And those had to do with the kind of the kind of chemical that is generated by your body when, for example, when you're surprised by something. The serotonin, the different substances that are generated within the brain to affect the brain. The fight and flee reaction when you're confronted with a dangerous animal, that kind of thing. And so I asked, well, how many of these of these substances are there? And they laughed, and they knew a little bit about my background, that I'm not a financier, that I'm a scientist. On the other hand, I haven't studied biology very much. And they said, well, if you had been a medical student 10 years ago, you would have learned about 12 of these, of these substances like serotonin or dopamine. Okay? Because the effect was known from the 19th century. So I say, well, how many are there? And he says, well, today, if you're in my lab, we study about 300 of them. And I said, well, how many are in the brain? And they said, it's not just in the brain. It's a false impression that people have that those things are in the brain. Yeah, they are in the brain because if you need a quick reaction to something, the reaction bypasses the brain. It bypasses the central nervous system. And say, well, where does it come from? Well, there are centers in the heart, there are centers in the sex organs, and there are centers in the stomach, there are centers everywhere in the body that can initiate flooding the organism in less than 1 second with a new substance. Well, okay, they never taught me that in school. So at that point, this is not a question of experimenting with LSD. I mean, this goes way beyond that. LSD is one of those substances that's created, so by nature. So the question is, knowing that, if we can manipulate that, what do what can we trust about the way we're seeing the universe? I mean, I think that gets to your question about
Yeah.
consciousness. Consciousness tells us something about the universe, but as an astronomer, uh, I can tell you that's not what the universe is. I mean, the universe extends into, the infrared, the X-ray, the ultraviolet, and so on. And that's where all the interesting phenomena of modern astronomy, modern astrophysics are taking place. You don't see any of that. You see beautiful stars. Now, the I think that it's not hopeless because we can design instruments knowing this, that, like what those people were doing with those synthetic cells that would react to a particular component of things that are in the body. Um, we can do that, and that will extend. But we should do that with, not, without a joke, with an open mind and an open brain. Um, we can, and I think again, I think UFOs. What we need to do is to look for instances in nature where nature itself is presenting us with opportunities to study them. So you can do that by going to the jungle, looking at substances that we've never discovered in the lab, that Indians, in the Amazon use certain trees and certain herbs to cure certain things. And I know doctors who've gone there and come back with a formula for a new drug that is now, prescribed in modern medicine. So we can continue to do that. We can look at nature for what it presents us. And UFOs are an obvious example because what they do is not understood. And yes, we can get propulsion ideas. Yeah, but that's just the tip of it. We can get things that are much more valuable if we study the people who were close to them, the people, including the people who are hurt and the people who have after effects, who see them again. As you know, I've developed friendships with many of those people, like the case of Valençol in France.
Yep.
The witness are things that he never told the investigators because he wanted to continue to experiment with them himself. He didn't want he didn't want the press to run with that. He didn't want to be accused of being crazy and so on. He knew he wasn't crazy, and he knew there was something there. And so we can talk to people like that. We can gain their confidence, and we can be part of their experience. And I think that's much more pregnant, if you want, as a scientific endeavor than all the secret stuff that the Pentagon has. I'm sure they have amazing pictures. Yeah, but the picture was taken by an instrument, and it's a correlation. To me, it's just a correlation to something that was a human experience. And it's a human experience I want.
Yeah.
And people don't realize that. They take the picture in the New York Times, they think it's a photograph.
Yeah. One thing you already given me plenty of time here, Jacques, on a Sunday. It's very, very kind of you, and I won't hold you too much longer. And please let me know if you have to run. But you going all the way back to J. Allen Hynek. I've always been wanting to ask you because, of course, just like yourself, he is one of the pioneers, and he had such a interesting story going from skeptic to believer. Can you explain how was he as a person, and in your eyes, and I know maybe you can't speak completely for him, but what happened to him since he basically concluded that UFOs did not exist, and then coming along and actually starting to believe himself? I mean, that journey, why did it happen?
People, when people think of my work with Dr. Hynek, there were times when we agreed, there were times where we disagreed. If our correspondence is ever published, and there is a university in the U.S. that has all of our correspondence, they'll see that we disagreed on a number of strategies or a number of things that we could have done. But there was one thing that we discovered that we agreed, that both of us were very interested in the history and philosophy of the Rosicrucians. And most of our discussions, once I got to know him and understand that about him, because I asked him that question, was, we would talk about UFOs for a while, we would talk about the different theories, and then we would start to talk about philosophy, and then we would start to talk about the process, the history of science, and the impact that the Rosicrucian thinking had on science. I mean, essentially, the Invisible College came out of the Rosicrucian movement in the U.S. And I had a friend, one of my colleagues here in California, said, "Oh yes, the Rosicrucians, it's a satanic sect." Well, the Rosicrucians came out of the Protestant movement in Switzerland and Germany. It came out as a profound religious extrapolation from the Protestant faith, and then developed more in the direction of science, as opposed to the Catholic attitude toward science, which was somewhat adversarial. So it was essentially a movement, and neither Dr. Hynek nor I were members of anything. He had been very interested in some of the early Rosicrucian books in the U.S. And I followed one of the groups for a while in France, but then I discovered that they were not really addressing the real historical, and deeper philosophical question that presents to science today. Okay. And but again, it's a question of looking 50 years back, to if you want to look 10 years ahead. And if you look 50 years back, you find, great scientists in England evoking ghosts, doing, attending seances, publishing books about phantoms and seances and all of that. And, and out of that came new branches of certainly new branches of philosophy, new branches of science. Mm-hmm. So that was very much the way, and he essentially told me that when he didn't know why the Air Force came to him as an astronomer, but he wasn't a leading astronomer, of the 20th century in America. Okay, he wasn't running Mount Palomar. He he was at the time at university in Ohio, where he got his PhD, and got his PhD in astrophysics, but he said, what always drove me in science was not what we know, but what we don't know. And, and those mysteries that you're talking about, what is the soul? Is there a soul? What does it do? Where does it go? Where does it come from? How do we know that what we think is true or not? How do we invoke things that are subtle energies to guide us, to have the insight into designing the next experiment? How can we do that? Those were the questions that the Rosicrucians were asking, going back to alchemy. I don't think they go back to, the Egyptians and so on. I think that's a nice idea. Certainly, you would find the same attitudes in the Greeks or the Egyptians and so on that was transmitted to us by the Arabs, by the Arab mystics. And that made its way into Europe. But no, this is modern. This is relatively modern movement from the last 2 centuries, from the 1800s. And, very much in line, again, with the movement in England, that gave rise to the Royal Society, and that became what we know today as science. But you need to go back, and you need to. We're always going back to the same basic mysteries, which are the things we were talking about. And the phenomena like UFOs, to me, are an opportunity to test certain ideas. What are they going to do next? Is the shape going to change? Are they going to present in different ways? Are they going to be more intrusive? Are they, what about those materials that they leave on the ground? They don't make sense. But a lot of things in nature don't make sense. You have to go beyond the obvious to see why nature has done something in that particular way. We don't understand the markings on the wings of butterflies. Why are there some butterflies whose markings are exactly those of a predator for a certain type of bird, so that the bird isn't going to attack the butterfly? How did that happen? If we don't think it happened just by design. It happened by the combination and I had that discussion with Dr. Nolan. It's not just the genes. If it was just the genes, evolution would not have happened the way it did. It's the intelligence that's contained in various combinations of genes in certain ways at certain times, at certain places on the earth, that gave us a particular capability and a particular body shape and particular markings on our wings. Okay, that's the way it happens. And we certainly don't understand it. So, we don't, but that's the frontier. That's a frontier in genetics, and of course all the substances that are behind, that are generated by the genome to affect certain functions in the body in certain ways, including the brain. So we are at that point, and it's we can't decide to ignore something like the UFO phenomena. And again, we're not going to get anywhere just by looking at what the F-18 from the Nimitz have seen. It's a very important component because it's a physics.
Yeah.
But we should not misunderstand the physics, and we should not. Of course, we have the best testimony you can produce with the eyes and the training of the men and women who were flying those planes. Okay, but we owe it to them to look beyond what they say to understand the full phenomenon. There is a memo, and maybe we should stop with that, but that illustrates the problem today for me. When the New York Times produced these images, that people think are pictures of a UFO, there was a very simple memo written by engineers from Raytheon, the Raytheon company in the US. They sent the memo to the Air Force, to the Navy, and they said, those pictures that you took with our instrument, because we sold you this, this camera, which is pretty big, and you mount it under the wing of the fighters, and people think it's a picture. Well, if you had given us a contract to develop a camera that took pictures, we would have done it. We would be happy to do that. But that's not what you wanted. You wanted something that could detect an enemy aircraft to kill it. And that's what we gave you. It's an infrared instrument. It doesn't take a picture the way a Kodak camera takes a picture. It doesn't give you the colors. It doesn't give you the details. And we give you a digital image of a source of heat. So don't go around talking about pictures taken with your camera, because that's not what we sold you. And if you give us a contract to take pictures of things in the sky, we can do that. But it's a different contract. The reason you gave us this contract is that it's by knowing the temperature of a target that you can kill an enemy aircraft. The F-18 is designed to place itself on the tail of an enemy aircraft and look at the exhaust from the engines. And we give you the temperature and the characteristics, the parameters of the heat that comes out of his engine. And from that, you can tell if it's a United flight, from San Francisco to Denmark, then we probably shouldn't shoot it, okay? But if it's a MiG, we'll recognize the signature of the MiG from the temperature of the exhaust that our infrared picture gives you, the infrared image is giving you, and then you can decide whether you want to shoot or not. That's what the camera does. That's not what the New York Times said. New York Times said, oh, look at that beautiful picture. It proves that, something about UFOs. It doesn't. It gives you an approximate temperature of a target in the sky. Now, people need to start understanding those things. I mean, this is pure technology. It's not even science. It's just today's technology that we keep misunderstanding because it matches our expectation of something. Now, what we want to know is, where are all the dozens of screen readings that were confiscated in the minutes after the incident? There was a plane that landed on the carrier. People confiscated all the readings from the Princeton radar, and they got it back to the plane, and they flew off somewhere. Who are these people?
That's the big
it's another thing from Close Encounters. Who are you people? We never heard from them again. So that's the data that we would need. And we understand why they took it. They didn't take it because of UFOs. They didn't care about UFOs. They took it because those radars were classified. So those readings had to be looked at by people who had the clearances for the process itself, as opposed to the sailors on the Princeton, who did not have the same clearances. Just like some of the pilots of the F-18 had certain clearances and others did not.
Mm.
And people talk about the image from the camera did not necessarily are not necessarily the pilots who had the camera.
Mm-hmm.
They are talking about some of their fellow pilots who talked about the camera, but we haven't interviewed those pilots, and they have a different set of clearances. So until you get into the weeds, into the nitty-gritty, it's hard to buy the conclusions that are in the press or on the internet.
Yeah.
You need to get together people who can go inside the structure of the information, in order to draw. And then you have to compare it to other cases like that. And that's where, I can come in. I can tell them that, there have been cases like that around the world, including cases that we know about, but that haven't been reported in the press. Now, they are within the 240,000 cases that we were working on in the Bigelow project that was stopped after 2 years. So you'll never, unless you bring in people with very special knowledge, you're never going to get to those cases. And you'll never have that information. And I think that's where we are now. We're in some ways we're moving forward, as we said, but in some ways we're also moving backward because we're losing in the process of trying to refine the information. We're losing the information. And
Yeah,
that's what I worry about.
Yeah, we're looking at a very narrow window
Yes.
of information and evidence, right? Because we
Yes.
got so
We need to
spoiled.
open the window.
Yeah, exactly. We got a little opening of the
Open
window.
it internationally.
Yeah. And that is, yeah. But it's, I mean, amazing to talk to you, Jacques, and to have seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind since I was 4 years old, I think, and having nightmares
Well,
about it.
that was a long time ago. I
Yeah.
think Mr. Spielberg has moved away from that. All of us have moved away from that. It was a lot of fun. And,
Yeah.
and I think Mr. Spielberg has an incredible, ability to capture the details that are vital, the details that are very important. And that movie was a contribution, but he's made many other movies since then. And I think
But he's coming back with another UFO movie. His next
that's
project.
what I understand. Yes,
Yeah.
but I'm not involved in that anymore.
Oh, but maybe
Gary Nolan may be involved, and that should be a lot of fun.
yeah, it should. But just to say that that movie back then, it was very visionary, and to talk to you now so many years later is such an honor because you sort of were in that movie, or of course Mr. Lacombe was sort of based on you, as I understand it, right? The French scientist character. So it's just amazing how many years you've been in this, and that you have an unwavering belief in the phenomenon is fantastic. So thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your time and your amazing answers to all of my stupid questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacques. It was, and this is off air. I actually read your
Yeah,
book.
we've ranged over a lot of things.
Yeah, we did. I think it was a very good interview, and I actually read your the first time I wrote a book of yours was Passport to Margonia. I read it in France, actually, in southern France, looking at the mountains. It was
Huh?
one of my best reading experiences ever, I think.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll talk again. And thank you for spending time on this and still
You know,
talking the good case. I love it. So you take
it
care, and yeah, maybe we'll talk another time.
will be a pleasure.
And if you
Thanks.
ever come to Denmark, Jacques, we will Anya will be on the Danish portion of this episode, and I am sure that you would have an open invitation to Niels Bohr Institute and anything you want to go. So don't hesitate to hit me up if you ever come here.
Okay. And we won't talk about Greenland.
Oh, yeah, that's not a good one. But
Huh? Take
hopefully they
care.
get to decide themselves, right?
Bye bye.
Okay, see you.